Right, Peter. It's a great pleasure and privilege to be interviewing Peter Rivière, who I've known for many years, in his now fairly denuded study in Oxford. Peter, tell me something about your parents and background.
Well, my father, who was born in the 1890s, in fact was a soldier, very unfortunate timing of his birth. He fought through both world wars. He was been about 20, I think, at the time the First World War opened, and he was still in active service in 1939, and therefore he didn't retire, in fact. He was invalided out in, I think, late 45 or early 46. But I didn't actually lead a sort of soldier's child's life. In other words, I wasn't transported all over the place endlessly, because when I was born, he was actually stationed at Tidworth, and my parents had a house just south of Tidworth, and then he was moved, I think, to Aldershot or somewhere, but decided to keep the house where it was, and then the war came. So in fact I didn't sort of troop round after the colours like so many soldiers' children have done. My mother was of a Scottish background. Her father was MP for Helensburgh in the 1920s, and was involved in shipping in Glasgow. He died, I think, about 2 weeks after I was born, in 1934, in January 1934. I think he died at the end of January 1934. And then after my father retired from the army, they had inherited a small farm in Sussex, so they moved there, and for about 10 years they farmed in Sussex before deciding this was too much of a good thing and moving back, in fact, to Wiltshire to live, in fact, between Salisbury and Winchester, where, in fact, they spent the rest of their life, in fact.
The name Rivière is I've always assumed there must be some French.
Well, there is, but I'm actually increasingly puzzled by it. I mean, the story is one is Huguenot, but I'm not convinced. I mean, I think everybody is Huguenot, if you see what I mean, unless one's careful. I know perfectly well, for example, my father's father, my paternal grandfather, still called himself Henri, which suggests to me that, in fact, the arrival in England was rather more recent than Huguenot refugees had been. And he, in fact, he lived in Wells. He was the organ master in Wells Cathedral. And my father was brought up there, in fact. But there are some other oddities about the name as well. I mean, the female side of my family passes rhesus negative down the whole time, and of course the great reservoir of rhesus negative is down in that southwest part of France, particularly in the Basque country. And also there's a family name, Gonzague, which my father had. My mother refused to allow me to be Gonzague, so the G was actually, my second initial G is Gonzague, but my son is Gonzague again. And where that comes from quite, it isn't quite Gonzales, if you see what I mean, and I'm not certain where that comes from, but one has a half suspicion it's somewhere south of France. I mean, it could be a marvellous sort of Oc or Catalonian version of a Gonzales or something of that sort. So I don't really know about the French side of it at all.
This is just before the Second World War that you're born, and you're going to school, your first school, really at the beginning of the war.
Yes. Interestingly enough, the first that I sent off to prep school, I suppose about 1941, something like that, I think, sort of standard 7, 8. Interestingly enough, is a school called Sandroyd, which had been evacuated from Surrey to, in fact, General Pitt Rivers's house at Tollard Royal in Wiltshire, and so, in fact, my prep school was in fact in that house, Rushmore House, which had been the old General Pitt Rivers's house. Already a connection, and of course one, in fact, was surrounded by these remains where he had, in fact, done all his original excavations in the area, and was brought up, rushing up and down these various mounds scattered round the grounds. Yes, and I went on from there to Stowe, and then National Service in the Air Force. was tended. I did fly, but then in fact the normal way of having too many of something or too few of something else, I ended up as a navigator rather than as a pilot, which was quite fun. I think, in fact, in those days, they sort of went round and everybody who had actually got any equivalents of A-levels were immediately told to go and be navigators because they could write, and everybody else was left as pilots, or something like that. Anyway, there was 2 years in the Air Force before I went up to Magdalen, Cambridge.
That's very nice. Was there anyone, quite often there's someone at school, one teacher or another teacher who inspires one. Was there anyone?
Yes, there was indeed. I know his initials. I have no idea what they stand for. There's a man called A.A. Dams. Well, there's a man actually before that, in fact, in my prep school. They both taught me Latin, actually. Well, in the second case, Latin and Greek. I think in the first case, Latin and Greek, now I think about it. I'm sure I started Greek at prep school. He was the Reverend Harry Smith was the first one at prep school, who was really quite an inspiring teacher. He did have really quite a strong influence on me. And so did A. Dams at Stowe, in fact. Quite a strong influence.
Encouraging you.
Yes, encouraging me a great deal. And in fact, I sort of had a sort of fairly meteoric career at Stowe, insofar as I think, in fact, I sat and took my, whatever they were called in those days, in 2 terms. Simply, I think, by his encouragement, in fact, yes. So, yes, I think those are the 2 certainly at school who influenced me most.
And then when you went to Magdalen, what did you read?
I, in fact, I was accepted to read geography, but I moved to Arcanant. I was actually, partly, I don't know why, but one just didn't think of it's like, one didn't know there was such a thing as Arcanant. Do you know what I think it's quite common even today that people don't know you can go to university and read anthropology, for example. Well, certainly it never crossed my mind, I think. And I'd done classics as whatever it was called, high school certificate, or it was, I think, Greek, Latin, and ancient history or something. Ancient history being entirely classical history, of course, which I had very much liked. And when I gave up geography quite quickly, it was in fact with the idea of being an archaeologist, really, in the first place, because I thought I was actually very interested in classical history, and I half assumed that archaeology would lead me to classical archaeology, which of course it didn't.
Did you do the 2 parts of the tripos?
No, I only did part 2, in fact. Yeah.
And by that time, it was still integrated, so you were still doing some archaeology?
They were still doing some archaeology and some biological anthropology, yes. And people I can remember, G.I. Jones was my tutor.
Can you tell us something about the
now what can I do? I don't know what quite to say here. Even back in, the 1950s, he looked slightly still out of Jurassic, slightly out of Jurassic Park. He was the last of the ex-district officers, I think, who, when they gave up being district officers, moved into teaching anthropology. Hutton was one, wasn't he? And who was the other? And Hodgson was one, of course, yes. They came exactly from that sort of background, and G.I. I think came exactly from that background as well. He wasn't a very demanding tutor. I seem to remember that, in fact. The other people I remember terribly well was Burkitt, yes, and, oh God, his name gone out of my head, the curator. Bushnell. Yes, who I remember. Yes, I remember well. And in those days, things were much freer and easier in museums, and you'd quite happily take you out into dining site to use spear throwers and whirl things around one's heads and such things.
Are you still doing that material culture examination where you had to identify objects?
Yes, one still did that, in fact. And indeed, I remember, because in fact, this was the time of animal, vegetable, and mineral.
That's right.
And Glyn Daniel was exactly one of my examiners. So the whole thing was really slightly weird, actually.
Yes. Who were your contemporaries as undergraduates then? Do you remember any?
I barely remember any of them. I think Ray was one.
Ray Abraham.
Yes. Yes, I think Ray was about that sort of time. But I really don't remember any of the others very much.
Well, Ray was taught a lot by Edmund Leach. Did you come across Edmund?
Virtually not very much, no. I can remember Meyer lecturing to us, all right.
I filmed him too. What was he?
Oh, more about West African kinship, I think. or not more, or only about West African kinship, in fact. Clans.
Lecturer, or a bit dry?
A bit dry, yes, really. And then when he came to give a merit lecture not that long ago here, I couldn't help being amazed by discovering, in fact, he illustrated with exactly the same pictures he illustrated, used for illustrations back in the 1950s. And you know, it's a sort of time warp. Suddenly see these slides again after.
Was Riviere fortune there?
Yes, he was. Yes, I forgot about Riviere. Yes. But I'm not absolutely certain he was there the whole time, if you understand what I mean. I think he had one of his periods when he was taken away for a while. I rather think he wasn't there the whole time.
Did he lecture you at all?
Yes.
It was repeatedly a very strange lecture.
He was a very strange lecturer indeed, in fact. He was a very strange man altogether, really. But yes, I'm trying to think who else was... I can't think.
Andy wasn't there by that time, was he?
No, he was...
Jack wasn't there by then.
Oh, no, Jack was about. Now, what would Jack have been doing, though? Did he have a research post for some time?
He was at the African Studies Centre.
Well, I think that is what... That's... Because I know he was about. But I don't think I don't remember him going into any lectures of Jack's at all, in fact. Yes.
And so you did your undergraduate degree, got a reasonable degree, and then decided to go straight on and do anthropology.
Oh no. There was a sort of 4-year hiatus. And I suppose this actually was quite important. I really out of the blue and by sheer chance, I was asked, in fact, if I would like to join what was basically a filming and botanical expedition to South America, which left in September after I came down, and was away for about a year. And so I went off on that. And I suppose that possibly geared me towards South America. And I actually met in Georgetown then for the first time Audrey Coulson, Audrey Butter she was then. And I met Audrey in Georgetown, and she had just come back, I think, from a bout of field work among the Africa, and was in Georgetown. I talked with her for quite a long time. Anyway, I got back to this country, knowing that, in fact, that I was very interested in South America and anthropology, but I didn't actually terribly feel like, at the time, going back into academia. I think, in fact, I had something else I wanted to get out of my system. I used to have a fascination with motor cars, which you could barely get me into a driving seat any longer. And I went off, and I was actually a motoring journalist for the autocar for 3 years. And actually had a great time. And by the end of 3 years, I'd worked it out of my system entirely. So that would have taken me up to, when did I come to Oxford? 60, must have been Michaelmas 62, I think. And that just about 3 years with the autocar. And learned two things, I think, from my days as a journalist. One was to write to time. In other words, I never had any deadline, troubles with deadlines, and write to length was the other thing I learned. Otherwise, somebody took out their blue pencil and scratched out all one's best best bits. And so one might have had to be sure, but those two things I did learn from being a journalist. Yeah, so they just got stuck, like riding bicycles, just got sort of stuck into it. And I can now, I reckon now, if somebody says write 1,000 words on something, I reckon I'll be within 10% of it, quite easily.
So you came back, how were you funded when you came back? Because it was still quite difficult to get,
when I came back,
This is to do a PhD?
This was, yes, in fact in those days one had to do a master's first. In fact, it was called a B.Lit in those days. It's now called an M.Lit. So these were mainly library ones. I did that before I started the doctorate.
What was the B.Lit on?
It was called an ethnographic survey of the native. I'm not going to get it quite right. The native peoples on the Amazon Guyana divide, or something like that. It was, in fact, an attempt to put some order into what was a mass of literature and try to make some sense out of what was several centuries of stuff with lots of different tribal names being scattered about, an attempt to put some order into it. It was quite a sort of hefty tome, in fact. I mean, I think it ran to a good 100,000 words. There were a lot of sort of maps of assumed migrations and such like. Highly suspect, but anyway, it satisfied the examiners, who were John Beattie and John Middleton. Why John Middleton? I can't remember, but anyway, John Beattie and John Middleton examined that thesis. And then, in fact, actually, don't forget, in those days, the fees were virtually nothing. And I could, in fact, actually support myself. For my my initial field work, I got a grant from an American institute called the Research Institute for the Study of Man in New York, which I think still exists. It wasn't particularly generous, but it was certainly enough to sort of cover airfares and costs, and living in the field cost virtually nothing anyway. So other than getting there and back, it wasn't expensive. And I think I'm right in saying that fees were incredibly low for graduate students. I mean, I think we were talking, £300 a year as a sort of figure that was the back of my mind.
Although £300.
You start multiplying it by inflation and such like, but even so, it's absolutely nothing compared with graduate fees today.
You chose Oxford, presumably because of Audrey Coulson.
It was Audrey Coulson. Also, in fact, one must remember at the time, and I can't remember if you remember this, Cambridge was not actually terribly interested in its graduate students. At all. I mean, and it really wasn't, even in fact, jumping ahead. When I was an assistant lecturer there briefly in whatever it was, 71, graduate students were very much getting the crumbs that fell from the undergraduate table, literally. And there wasn't an awful lot of emphasis on the graduates there. And in many ways, the Institute actually dominated graduate work. I mean, if you look at the number of theses and such like coming out at the Institute, it was sort of higher than all the other departments. And there were only about 4 departments actually doing graduate work anyway. I mean, I think SOAS, LSE, UCL, Cambridge and Oxford, I think, were the only graduate departments at all. And obviously Audrey was an influence, although Audrey was not my supervisor.
Who was it?
Rodney. Yes. I'm not quite certain how this was agreed. It was thought, I think, that I was anyway likely to get so much help from Audrey. And on top of which, you see, Audrey was in the Department of Ethnology and Prehistory. And to go into some of the background of that, I'm meant to be writing for the Institute's 100th anniversary in 2005, a history of anthropology at Oxford. So in due course somebody will be able to read my views on the problems relating to a difference between an Institute of Social Anthropology and the Department of Ethnology and Prehistory. But in fact there was a considerable demarcation disputes and such like, and people who were in the Institute tended not to be allowed to be supervised by people. I mean, there were things like that. And that actually carried on until 8 years ago almost. There was just a demarcation that people were very protective about. So Rodney in fact actually supervised both my masters and the doctorate, in fact. Yes.
Can you say something about Rodney for the film?
Yes, I mean he in fact, as you imagine, was an extremely efficient but demanding supervisor.
He read everything very carefully.
he read everything extremely carefully and extremely quickly. I mean, in other words, you give him something, it would come back very heavily annotated within 24 hours without fail. And he has this precise and minute handwriting, of which the margins tended to be absolutely covered inevitably. But he in that way, yes, he was extremely demanding. If you let him, he probably could have did, in fact, I think on most people, have a very strong theoretical influence. I mean, there were certain people whose names were not allowed to be mentioned in theses, and he would score them out, you know, saying, people like Murdoch or anybody like, yes, or Lounsbury or Scheffler or anybody like that would be. And certainly Schneider, and anybody like that was immediately. Mainly Americans, yes. Mainly Americans, not entirely. I'm trying to think, in fact, who else he perhaps might have had a thing again. There were not. He wouldn't. I think he'd let Meyer's name pass, but not with great enthusiasm. And he would, I think, be doubtful about Jack. But people certainly like Raymond Firth, he would, and Edmund Leach, of course, he would heartily approve of. Yes. Yes, I mean, to some extent, yes, I mean, I think he tended, and I think, in fact, if you looked at the theses of all his students, you'd see, in fact, a very strong bias as a result of his supervision, in fact.
And this is just the exciting period in the early 60s when Berry Straus's work, I don't want to overlap. Are you going to talk a lot about this? Well, let's leave Berry Strauss, but obviously this is a background.
Yes.
He was translating some of his work and
yes.
so on. So you did your thesis and your work, which we'll hear more about later, and then what happened after? Let me see, I think the first year, that would have been 65, 66. I was in Oxford doing tutorial work as one of the sort of normal hangers-on penumbras of all Oxford and Cambridge departments, in other words, giving tutorials. And at the end of that year, I got a research fellowship at the newly opened Institute for Latin American Studies at London University. And that was a 2-year research fellowship. And I spent some part of that fellowship in Brazil, doing my work amongst the ranching communities of North Brazil. And then after 2 years, I think it was just a 2-year post, in fact. Anyway, for the next year, I in fact replaced Audrey Colson. Audrey was off, and I in fact was here as acting lecturer and took her classes and tutorials and all that sort of thing for the year. And during that year, I was appointed to be. Oh, I've forgotten. I missed a year. From London. I went to Harvard for a year. I was taken on as a visiting lecturer to replace in one semester Vogt, and in the second semester Mabry Lewis. So I was there at Harvard for a year, and then came back and took up Audrey Colson's job for a year. And during that year I was appointed to an assistant lecturer at Cambridge. It was an assistant lecturership quite specifically in social anthropology of Latin America. And although I shared but did not use the room, because I don't think anybody used it, it was a room just at the top, at the first land, up the first flight of stairs. Yes. And it was outside of the library. Yes, and I shared it with Edmund and Tamby
and myself, but I don't think, it was knee-deep in dust and very dark, and I don't actually remember any of, perhaps it was too dark for us to see anybody else in there, but I mainly used the room in the new history building, because the Latin American Centre was over there, and I was given a room there, and I tended to use it. I remember it was a horrific building. I mean, it still is a horrific building. It was miserable to be in. It was either too hot or too cold, and the wind shrieked through it, and the rain poured down. I mean, it was absolutely frightful. And one of the worst noises was a tramp of architectural students' feet going round the place being told how marvellous it was. And so that was the year, and during that year, it was actually John Beattie's post. He went off to Leiden, and his post was advertised, and I applied and got it. So in fact I was only the year in Cambridge, and came back here to the post I, for all intents and purposes, I'm just about to retire from. So I took that up in '71, so it's been exactly 30 years. Yeah. And yes, the year in Cambridge, I seem to remember what I did. I lectured on myth, I remember that, and I also gave a lecture to first year students on economics and environment, in other words, habitat, economy and society, basically. I gave one on, and I gave that course, and myth, and I think I gave one on kinship as well, in fact. I seem to remember, but it was just that year.
Well, I once compared the lecture timetables of the early 70s
Oh, yes.
with what they lecture now, and at that time it was normal to give about 2 or 3 courses, each of 4 or 8 lectures.
Yes.
Now you're giving 5 courses of 8 lectures.
Oh, really? Yes.
And the numbers of lecturers has more than doubled.
Yes.
So the students are now getting
Too many lectures.
about 6 times more lectures than they used to get, which is disastrous. Now you come back to Oxford, but actually I meant to ask you, when you were there in the 60s, 62, 63, which is when I was also in Oxford, just transferring to anthropology, or at least thinking about it, the great figure who was just moving out and whose sofa you have in your room was Evans Pritchard.
Oh, yes, yes.
Can you say something about EP just in his last?
He was yes, I mean, in some ways it's slightly sad, because in fact I saw him in increasing decline in some ways. I think even by the time I arrived here in the 60s, he'd, I think, probably passed his peak. He was still a formidable intellect, and a thoroughly intriguing man, and on the whole, very approachable. He was very happy to. He carried. I mean, his daily routine was interesting, but a bit tiresome for other people. He used to get up terribly early. That meant by about 12 o'clock, he reckoned he'd done his day's work, and therefore was looking for people to go to the pub with and entertain. And so therefore he could, inevitably by 11 o'clock, he was sort of prowling around looking for anybody who might in fact be dragged off to the pub. We were in Keble Road at the time, just on the edge of Keble Road. So in fact there was rather further to walk to pubs now than there are now, in fact, and used to use quite a range of them, in fact. The Bird and the Baby, inevitably, and the Lamb and Flag, and the King's Head, King's Arms. I mean King's Arms. Anyway, I mean all used, and the Turl as well, in fact. So yes, and I mean he remained, I mean, extraordinarily energetic, but if a little bit absent-minded, I think, really up to his last days, in fact. I know some people found him very difficult to cope with. I mean, his particular idiosyncrasies, and he could take against people in really rather unpleasant ways, in fact. Something I think which, a trait which I think Godfrey Linhart slightly inherited as well. That Godfrey could be unbelievably unpleasant to people for no obvious reason if he suddenly decided that he actually didn't like the way their hair was brushed or something like that, for no obvious reason anyway, that he wouldn't, and be very nasty indeed. And I think EP was sometimes a bit like that as well. I think one of the pities about, if EP had liked to, I think in the 1950s, gone out and got sufficient money to properly endow this institute, he almost certainly could have done. I mean, there's some evidence suggests that one or two of the big foundations were almost queuing up to give him money, and he just didn't bother ever to follow anything through. And there was little or no. The place was run in a quite incredibly lackadaisical manner. When I was appointed in 1971, I was the first person ever to be appointed to the Institute as a result of an interview. Before that, people had just been nominated. Frequently not even advertised. Well, I think not advertised, and certainly no interviews. And the people's names were just put forward and rubber stamped by the faculty board and then rubber stamped by the general board, which is quite startling, actually, if one thinks about it, compared with the sort of procedures one has to go through nowadays. And I suppose Edwin Ardner, I think, would have been the last person who was just appointed. And I was the one after that, and suddenly by that time there were advertisements and curriculum vitae and letters of reference and all sorts of things. I once came across, after Maurice Friedman died, I actually inherited his desk, which was that one. And while it had been cleared out, it hadn't actually been cleared out as well as it might have been. And at the back of one drawer, I found, in fact, the paperwork relating, in fact, to the post which I got when it was advertised. And I actually found my letter of application. And rather more interestingly were the letters of reference, one of which had been Edmund. And Edmund starts off with a marvellous flourish, saying, "On absolutely no account am I willing to recommend this candidate." Which is a good way, it's a marvellous way to start.
Typical Edmund, isn't it?
Typical Edmund, yes. Yes. And he went on to say, he went on from there to say how much he wanted me to stay at Cambridge.
Oh, I see.
Yes.
That's all right.
Yes. And it's not absolutely beautiful, it's sort of real eye-catching stuff. And then he went on to saying, I really want him here in Cambridge. Edmund, I don't know what you found with Edmund. I never really managed to have whatever you might call it, a professional conversation with him. We always did it in writing. And at Cambridge we passed backwards and forwards endless notes, mainly about Levi-Straussian myth analysis. But we never actually, when we met, we didn't sort of make any reference to our correspondence, so to speak, but we had carried on this extraordinary correspondence.
You've got copies of that, I heard.
I don't know if I have, actually. I'm afraid. I know now, but I don't think I have, actually. Yes.
Well, he might have the other end of it, because his archive, of course, is it.
He might, in fact, have the other end of it, yes, yes. And it was pre-email, of course. I mean, this was stuff shoved into the internal mail every day.
Yeah. Godfrey, just another word on Godfrey.
Yes.
He was a formidable mind as well.
He was indeed. It's one of these things. people would say that in many ways Divinity and Experience is an infinitely better book than Neureligion, for example, and much more scholarly and much more insightful than Neureligion. But on the other hand, you know, would Godfrey have achieved what he did without having EP before him, so to speak? I mentioned Godfrey about this curious side of him that took against people. On the other hand, he was quite incredibly kind and generous. I cannot be certain about this, but I had in fact a student who was indeed a mature student. She was about 50, but she was an Irish nun who had in fact spent decades of her life working on the streets of São Paulo, often actually living on the streets trying to protect children from gangs out to murder them. And being of a particular order, there were awful problems about fees and such like. And suddenly, out of the blue, she had told all her fees had been paid. And now I can't be absolutely certain. I'm almost certain that it was Godfrey. I mean, just happened. Nobody said anything. She'd just been told that the fees. And she was at Wolfson, and where Godfrey had been a fellow, and he knew her very well. And I suppose, in fact, it was part of Catholics keeping together or something like that. Although I got into awful trouble from Mary Douglas because I gave the address at Godfrey's funeral. And Godfrey had a sung Latin Mass, and it had been one of his last wishes. And I did say in my address that, in fact, that to some extent Godfrey's religion belief had lapsed, and he had not been to Mass for a long time and such like. But as his service showed, he had returned to it. And Mary laid into me afterwards and said, "Nonsense. Godfrey went to Mass every Sunday, I know." And trying to assure Mary that was definitely not so, and that was impossible. She just refused to believe that he hadn't.
Well, Mary Douglas herself was a pupil of EP,
yes, it would have been. Well, I'm not certain, actually. Yes, I think EP, but I have a funny feeling that John Peristiani might have actually also.
She was at Oxford, wasn't she?
Oh, yes, she was. Yes, she's one of these people who changed her name. She's Mary Tew. And you find her earlier publications under Tew.
Have you come across her? Did you come across her much? Or?
Well, actually, she was one of my referees in 1971 as well, in fact. I got to know her well when I was at the Institute of Latin American Studies in London and was an honorary research fellow at UCL, yes. And I got to know her well then, yes.
And the other person there was Ian Lewis, was it? Or?
Ewan Lewis, he must have moved off to LSE by then, I think. I mean, Darrell was still there as professor when
Yes.
a rather jovial, hale, well-met sort of fellow, with a great deal to say. Yes, extraordinarily pleasant, rather old school character, in fact. Yes, he didn't leave any sort of lasting impression on me, I must say. Yes.
We were both sucked up, moving from the local scene to the national scene. We were both sucked up for some time into the Economic and Social Research Council. You were chairman, weren't you?
Yes, yes.
That committee. I wondered if you had any reflections on the ESRC as you remember it.
Nothing polite. I mean, it always was an extremely odd organisation, to put it mildly. I think I had something like 12 years of it, and because I joined the Social Anthropology Committee on the SSRC, and then became chairman of that committee. And then, if you remember, the SSRC was turned into the ESRC, and the subject committees were all abolished. And at that point, I was put as vice chairman of the research committee of the ESRC and on the international committee. And I hung around on the SSRC, ESRC, I think it was very nearly 12 years. And it became, in fact, increasingly bureaucratic. And I mean, I think it's gone actually steadily downhill. Instead of just being a sort of passive obstacle to research, I now think it's actively engaged in prohibiting research of any sort.
Yes, that was my impression too, and I had the 12 years that you had, just slightly later, but
Yeah.
I mean, I'm just keep well away from it.
Yeah.
And when my students say they haven't got an ESRC research award, I clap my hands
Yes.
and rejoice.
One of the most disgraceful things that happened to me on the ESRC, which it might interest you as a sort of Cambridge aspect, I was put as chairman of the review committee for CAMPOP. I can't think of its full...
Cambridge Group for Population and Social Science.
Yes, because that was going to be reviewed.
Yeah.
And they, in fact, although in fact that huge, great volume on English demography had just come out, and the SRC were incredibly proud of it. They wanted to close the thing down, basically. And I chaired this thing, and our findings were such that we said, this is absolutely absurd, it must continue, give it as much money as it needs, it's the best thing you're doing, etc. And the man who was secretary of the committee rang me up and said, the secretary of the ESRC says, we can't put that report in, we have to put in a report saying it's got to be closed down. And I said, I am not going to do that. I will resign before I do that, and I'll ring up every member of the committee and recommend they resign as well. And they climbed down and let the report go through. But in the end it made no difference, because what basically happened was when it got to council, they declined to accept the report and turned the what was then I think it was called something, but they turned it into something else which had a unit which had a much shorter life and different sorts of funding and all sorts of things like that. But I mean, the sheer disgrace of actually going through this thing and then being told, in fact, we've got to gone through the procedure and then be told they had to recommend.
Yeah, it was absolutely monstrous, the whole thing. Yeah. Someone else you mentioned about if Laura's going to deal with this person, David Maybury Lewis.
Oh yes.
I've known David for many years and I'm very fond of him. He presumably overlaps with your interests.
Yes, in some ways we sort of overlap. I mean, he was an undergraduate at Cambridge and then came here and was supervised by Rodney. And I first met David in a sort of Dr. Livingstone, I presume, sort of situation on the banks of the Rio dos Mortis in central Brazil. And yes, it would have been 1957, 58. And I think David then was doing a second bout of field work among the Chavanti. And then, in fact, I sort of knew him well, and of course, when the year I was at Harvard, he was there during the first semester. He was off during the second semester when I took over, but I got to know him well then. And he's through Oxford. He has sisters who live in Oxford, and he's quite frequently here, and I see him really. In fact, I saw him last month, I think, yes. And he, in fact, is now decided he wants to retire and has actually got a date for it. I don't know how. I think under normal American procedure he can go on as long as he wants, but I think even he's got a bit tired of it finally.
Will he come back?
Oh, I'm sure not. No. I'd be very surprised if he does. Well, I don't know. He's got a son who works and lives in London. The other son is still in the States. But I don't think so. No, I don't. I would be surprised if he did.
And one of your younger colleagues in that area is my ex-head of department, Stephen Bugett.
Oh yes,
yes. PhD examiner, I believe.
Yes.
Have you had many dealings with Stephen?
Oh yes. Stephen actually got the lectureship I gave up at Cambridge. I mean, he then became the assistant lecturer in that most studies. And I can't really think when Stephen and I paths crossed for the first time. He the year I was at Cambridge, he and Christine had just come back from Colombia, from the Barasana. And one of the things I remember so well was Christine giving a a departmental seminar. And she, inevitably, as people do talking about the Barasana, was on about anacondas. And the first question, I think, came from Maya, whose question went roughly like this: you don't mean to say that the Barasana really believe in all this nonsense about about anacondas? But yes, I mean, Stephen and Christine actually took, when I was on leave, actually took over my post here for a year. This was before she disappeared off to become a medic. Yes. She did 1 year, and then I think went off to become a medic, and another year I was off. It was Paul Henley, in fact, who took over. Yes, I mean, yes, Stephen has been a great friend for years and years, yes. And I examined both their theses in due course, yes.
I was wondering whether we're just coming, I think, towards a natural turnover to the South American work, but whether you had any sort of reflections on the major changes in this 30 years or so since you've been lecturing, or even from the early 60s, the major changes in anthropology, either organisationally or theoretically, or the world into which young graduate students now come. You described the rather ramshackle appointments, the growing bureaucratisation of the SRC and so on. Is this the general trend?
I think it's a general trend. The thing that strikes me about academic life in general, not particularly about anthropology, which has changed most, is the fact that I can remember a time when, at lunch, we used to talk about academic matters, and now we only talk about money. I mean, basically. Yes, yes. This is the most startling thing, I think, that has taken place. But this has gone hand in hand, of course, with the extraordinary bureaucratization of the whole of academia. So we spend half our time explaining what we're doing in the other half, or justifying what we're doing in the other half of the time. It seems to me to be an extraordinary amount of time and effort that goes into justifying our existence rather than getting on with our existence. Has anthropology changed? I do slightly worry about where it's going sometimes. I mean, there still are a lot of people who do, in fact, seem quite genuinely interested in the sort of things that I was interested in, and almost everybody was interested in. But there's an enormous amount of things which are getting very close to being NGO studies. I mean, a number of people who seem to be interested in working on Oxfam and fair trade deals and such like. And they're not actually interested in, to the same degree, in other people's ideas. I mean, for example, just to take, I don't think it would dawn on anybody of discovering something like a Zandi witchcraft today, because they're not those sort of questions are completely and increasingly dropping out. It is, I think, becoming more and more applied in some ways. There's a lot of application, and a lot of it is, and also, yes, I mean, it's not true. There's some people, in fact, who are quite happy to go off, but a number of people, in fact, who actually find the thought of going and doing field work anywhere remote actually rather difficult to stomach, I find. And they tend not to do so.
Do you think the questions have become more narrowed? I mean, the questions that EP, for example, though he's an extreme case, were asking were very general questions of a philosophical nature, and Godfrey, and all those generation of anthropologists. What is man? What is culture?
Yes.
What, and so on.
I think there's far less of that being asked today. Yes. As I said, I mean, just looking at the sorts of research students are doing, a lot of it is very narrow range indeed, in fact. I mean, how fair is this fair trade, so to speak, which doesn't seem to me to have that much in the way of interesting questions to ask, and you end up, in fact, writing something more like a report than a thesis, in my view, unless one is careful.
And now you're retiring, Peter, and what are you going to do?
Oh, well, I have two things, two immediate things I'm doing. I've got a very large volume for the Hackett Society that I'm working on. I can't actually work out how large it is, but we're talking about over 300,000 words. I mean, it's on that sort of scale. It's about halfway through, and I told the Hackett Society they can have it at the end of 2002, which I think is about right. Although it'll be some time after that, by the time things index and such like it, obviously, but they can actually have the finished typescripts and everything else, the transcriptions and everything else by that time. And that's on a man called Robert Schomburg, who was one of the 19th century scientific traveller who opened up the whole area I've done most of my work in, and did much of the early surveying, did the early surveying of the area. And after that, in time for the centennial celebrations, if celebrations is the right word, of the Institute, I have agreed to do this book on the history of anthropology in Oxford, which will go back to the 1860s. The first anthropological society in Oxford is the late 1850s. And from then onwards there were constant attempts to try and get anthropology into, first of all, natural science honours school. And there's quite an interesting story to be told there, and of course the arrival of Tyler and the Pitt Rivers Museum and such like, and then the Institute actually being created in 1905. And the first exam sat for the first time in 1908, what was then the diploma, yes, which was still there, of course, until 10, 12 years ago. It was still called diploma, but nobody wanted a diploma by that time, so it turned it over to being a master.
It'd be nice to have a copy of that one day alongside the tape. I was just wondering, I sometimes, obviously there are many other questions, if there'd been more time to ask, but was there anything that I've left out that you think would be nice to have been asked in relation to either your earlier part of your life or...
I mean, the only thing I think perhaps which is it has clearly influenced my my academic career and such like, is that I mentioned sort of 12 years of the SRC, but there has been an enormous amount of internal Oxford stuff as well, as chairman of faculty boards, being on the general board of faculties for 6 years, which spawns committees faster than any frog can. Those, in fact, had at times, the 6 years, I think, I mean, if you looked, I think, at my list of publications, or drew a graph, you could quite clearly see those years on the general board when there would have been a very sharp dip indeed. So that, in fact, there has been, and I think it's one of those things that once one becomes known as a sort of committee man, unless one's careful, it's very difficult not to go on being a committee man.
And Vice Principal of Linacre?
As Vice Principal of Linacre, which occupied about during term time a day a week. Quite a lot, but Wednesdays were almost entirely devoted to college business.
But rewarding and enjoyable.
Well, quite, yes. I mean, one was there slightly as a sort of backup, in as much as one had to go to all committees in case the principal dropped dead and one had to suddenly take over everything. So one was slightly there as a sort of understudy, as much as anything else.
You were Vice Principal, at least towards the end, with my almost exact co-equal, Paul Slack.
Oh yes.
If there was anything about Paul
Well, I chaired the search committee, which appointed Paul, and indeed we invited Paul to apply.
Really?
Yes, and which he did. And I think, in fact, it's been an extremely satisfactory choice. In fact, it's worked extremely well. He's somebody, in fact, who, as you know, is not only an incredibly good historian, but in fact also has had a very wide experience of the university at lots of different levels. And he was actually chairman of the general board for a while. In fact, he was when we appointed him principal, in fact. And then he's now Pro Vice Chancellor in charge of libraries and museums and everything. So yes, yes, I think he's a fairly good choice. In fact, at the moment, I mean, if I was vice principal, if I had been vice principal at the moment, in fact, it would have been a much busier time because of his Pro Vice Chancellorship, and therefore having to look after one whole division of the university under its new administrative arrangements. The present vice principal is closer to an acting principal than just simply a stand-in.
Well, you've done an enormous amount administratively for anthropology and also for Latin American studies, where you mentioned. So perhaps we can now thank you very much indeed and turn, we're after a little break, to Latin American topics.
Right.
Thank you very much indeed.